we'll start the recording. Thank you everyone for joining our webinar on accurate and instant reporting must-haves that most people miss. Your presenters today will be Cho and Yuri, and they're going to walk you through dashboards and a demo. We'll have the opportunity for questions at the end, but throughout the presentation, you can use the Q&A portion of the Zoom to ask questions. And then we will be sending out the recording as well as slides to people after the webinar. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Cho.
Thank you, Kira, and welcome everyone. My name is Cho. I'm a product manager of data connection at Cherre, and I have been building like CRE data products and analytics for all my career by this point, and very excited to share my learnings and best practice in the industry with you today. And I'm going to let Yuri to introduce himself as well.
Hi, everybody. My name is Yuri Anderson. I have 13 years experience in building commercial real estate applications for owners, lenders, investors, brokers, and I'm a product manager of commercial real estate here at Cherre. And I'm very excited to show you what some of our dashboard capabilities are here to optimize performance of your portfolios and properties.
Yeah, sounds great. So let's get started. I'm going to open with the tagline of today's webinar, which is the data strategy is the engine. So we need to have a really solid data strategy. That is the key to power any accurate and instant reporting. So first of all, what is a data strategy? In this webinar, I'll refer that as the process of acquiring, organizing, analyzing, and delivering data to help with decision making. So if you're working with data on a day-to-day basis, the way that you interact with the data is essentially your data strategy, even if it may not be explicitly defined in a formal way. So you're maybe collecting data manually through vendors in the spreadsheet format every month, and you're doing some fuzzy matching, building VLOOKUP formula in the spreadsheet. And not to say that this could be a very long and manual process, and you probably need to do or repeat this process a couple times every month, every quarter, in order to get that reporting going. And each step along the way, there could be room for human errors. To make things worse, that every team within the same organization could have their own version of this process or data strategy. That the asset management team could be using a totally different reporting or performance metric definition as the portfolio management team is looking at the portfolio performance. So as we all know, your report is only as good as your data. If we can improve on our data strategy, that means that we'll have a much better reporting and successful experience and results because of that solid data strategy. Cool, so how do we do to create a winning data strategy? I've laid out 3 steps or 3 areas that we can look into to make our data strategy a winning strategy. So as a product person, I always like to start with the business goals. This is probably the favorite part of the job being a product manager, because this is essentially the same process of gathering your Christmas wish list. So in this case, so as portfolio managers or asset managers, that we want to have this up-to-date performance monitoring capability, that we do not want some lagged information, say 3 weeks after the quarter closed. And if we can probably want a daily update on our portfolio performance. And we want this process as seamless as possible. In addition to that, we also want to be able to benchmark our portfolio performance against the market, the sub-market, or our peers, our competitors in a sense, or just to our own historical performance. And then from an internal operations perspective, that we want to able to maximize the operational efficiency. Like we've talked about at the beginning, that the reporting process is usually a very long and manual process that I could totally picture as a team of 3 analysts spending at least 2 weeks at each quarter end in order to get the data from different sources all consolidated together and map that correctly to the standard reporting format that we have, and then put that into a spreadsheet or PowerPoint slide for reporting purposes. After we have defined the business goals, let's think about the top personas that we'll be serving here. So for portfolio managers and executives, they want this bird's view into how the performance, how the portfolio is doing on a higher level. With asset managers and operations team, they might want to dig really deep into the day-to-day operations on the property level in terms of the expenses and the income numbers, and they want to find opportunities to optimize the cash flows on the properties. Not to mention that we also have data analysts and engineers who want to build an automated data process to make this reporting as painless as possible, and we can have the data flow directly into the reports every time without any human intervention. Putting these two together, then we have our user story here, which is an example of a North Star goal that we can work towards on this data journey. So as a portfolio manager, I like to know my up-to-date portfolio performance in comparison to the markets, to my peers, to my own historical performance. So once we have this goal defined or settled, that it's time for us to think about a map of how we can get there. So taking the same example of benchmarking, that we always want to start with the goals or questions that we want answers to, just to refresh our memories that we are this portfolio manager, that we want this live portfolio performance and benchmarking capabilities in terms of the definitions that we have laid out here. Then let's spend a moment to think of the data set or the data sources that will help us to achieve this goal. For example, that we want market fundamentals, and we want this from Lease that will provide us not only market, but also some market level absorptions, supply and demand, or the demand drivers within each market. And we also want to add RCA to the mix. So RCA will tell us about the sales counts in the same market, in the same zip code, about the transaction per square foot, or the price, the cap rate that all those transactions about. In addition to that, we also want to add benchmarks to this recipe. For example, we can add TREP as the operations expenses aggregates, and not to mention that we can use NCREIF as the return benchmarks that we could use to evaluate how our own portfolio is performing as compared to all these benchmark indicators that we have. So in terms of our own data, most of the case, it could live in Excel that coming from other asset management applications that we have, and this will have the revenue and expenses number defined on buildings, floors, units, and tenants. Cool. So now we have the goals, we have a map. It's time to execute on this data strategy. So we want to build a very solid data infrastructure and reporting solutions that will help us to achieve this very ambitious reporting goals that we have. The first idea that comes to my mind is probably we need to build a centralized data hub. As simple as this sounds, actually, it's not the most straightforward aggregation or connection work that you think. For example, do we know what are our data we're referencing here, and how can we make use of them? So this is a very comprehensive graph. Here is an extended version of the data map that we just saw earlier, that we have all these different systems. For example, let's start from the top, that we have valuations, debt, leases, financials, and we have the deals from our deal pipeline management applications. And all of these systems, they're actually talking about buildings. In this case, let's say we have 2 buildings under management, and we have defined that as building 1 and building 2. In addition to that, we want to augment our data by using some external sources like Google, Bing, or Melissa migration data. However, these sources are on an address level. If we look closer here, though we have 2 buildings, the building on the left-hand side has 2 entrances, and each entrance has its own address. So we end up with 3 addresses that we need to have resolution on in order to connect all these different sources effectively. To make things more complicated, we have some data providers such as Cherre, RCA, Comstack, that they're all talking about parcel level information, because actually parcel is the transactable entity that we can buy and sell in a real estate deal, and that is referring to the land or piece of parcel underneath those 2 buildings. So how do we map all of this together? Then that means that we need to have this mapping exercise as one of the most important steps within our data strategy. So here we have some examples that we want to map VTS data into leases, into properties, and then RCA is talking about the property level information. And then Excel, we have some lease information in Excel, and we also have our chart of accounts in Excel as well. So in order to make an apple-to-apple comparison, like we cannot skip this mapping exercise. And I will say this is probably the most relevant or important step that we need to do in this process. And then if we have done this correctly, we'll end up with a very robust data model. So even if we have data from all kinds of sources, but we can segment them into different data objects. For example, we have trial balances. This could come from the Excel file, could come from our internal systems. And then we have the tenants, leases, all of this will be connected logically in order to power any downstream reporting that we're going to do. Cool. In order to pull everything together, like we want to define that data flow in this data strategy journey. So this is the Cherre way. So at the beginning of the pipeline, we are going to do a preparation or staging step, if you will, that will be responsible for creating an automated data ingestion process. We'll do all sorts of data sorting, cleaning, and normalization in this step. That will include all of the different sources that we have just talked about. It can be either a direct API connection or from another database, or just spreadsheets, CSV files, or it can be triggered by events. And then after that, we're going to connect everything together. So that is the connection mapping part. At Cherre, we connect on addresses, and also we do that on the geospatial level as well. This includes the entity mapping that we talked about briefly earlier, about having 3 addresses for the 2 buildings. How do we come up with a single identifier of the asset or property that in our system? And in this step, we'll usually have some custom SQL transformation, and then we'll be creating the custom object modeling as we talked about before. And then that brings us to the delivery module. So here we have defined that we want to consume the data in the API or from a data warehouse that will put this data into the hands of our users. That means that they will be able to consume the data through a BI dashboard, or our data science team will be able to leverage the API or data warehouse directly with this cleaned and sorted data. And not to mention that we can also build all kinds of internal custom applications on this data set that is the single source of truth that is available to all teams with the organization. Cool. So now we have a winning data strategy that I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Yuri here. We have made some new adjustments to the dashboard you're going to see. So you're among the first group of audience that we have ever demoed this dashboards to. And any questions and comments is always appreciated. Yuri.
Thank you. One moment while I pull up the latest and greatest. So now once we've connected all this data for you across the disparate systems that you consume, whether it be Yardi or MRI for your property management accounting, whether it be Lease for transactional data, and comps, I'm sorry, Lease for market performance data for leasing, whether you're also using NACREIF to benchmark against for returns. All of this is now interconnected and can be placed into one of our out-of-the-box dashboards. So we have built a set of out-of-the-box dashboards, one for each asset class, specifically for the asset management use case. So whether you're a head of asset management at the executive level, or a portfolio manager, or an asset manager, these dashboards will be exceptionally useful for you for performance monitoring purposes day to day, either at the portfolio level, at the fund level, or all the way down to the property, and will be fed in that up-to-date internal data from systems like Yardi, giving you daily integrity and transparency into the operational and financial performance of your portfolio, as well as giving you the ability to benchmark against the key data sets that have been connected and resolved, and also the ability to gauge returns as well as forecast, and prepare your asset performance for any kind of capital expenditure deployments, et cetera. So here we start on a portfolio summary dashboard. I've got my KPIs at the top summarizing the entire portfolio. In this case, an office portfolio of 264 properties. I can see the size of the portfolio, the average property size, what my current occupancy levels are, my asking rent levels, my weighted average lease term, 12-month rent growth, leasing activity, and 12-month net absorption. So the most critical metrics that I want to track from an operational perspective across my portfolio are at my fingertips. At the same time, I can also filter any of this data, both the KPIs as well as the visualizations below, by a set of universal filters. So I can filter these 263 properties by fund, by market, for the markets within my portfolio, by asset manager specifically, if I'm looking to isolate specific performance of an asset manager, if I am that asset manager and I just want to look at my properties acquisition year. And on the portfolio summary, I'm going to get that 30,000 foot view, an executive level view of all the properties within my portfolio and their performance. So where are they located geographically? What is their distribution across the funds that I manage? What are the lease expirations by square footage across the portfolio that are coming up? And all of these charts are very interactive. Using the concept of guided analytics, you can drill in and see that here in Q4 of 2023, you've got major rollover events happening across your entire portfolio. Drill in and immediately see the underlying leases and properties where those expirations are occurring, and sort them by lease end date, by the square footage, and also export any of this data to Excel or into a PDF. And once again, updated with daily integrity. So as good as the quality that's being put into the systems by your colleagues. Now I can also see how my portfolio is performing against critical benchmarks such as NACREIF. So all of my properties within my portfolio, I can see what my property return is, my appreciation return, and get a total return, and then immediately compare that with the NACREIF MSA, in this case for Atlanta, its income return, appreciation return, and total return, and then see whether I've outperformed or underperformed the benchmark. Nobody else in the space can give you and provide the kind of benchmarking capability that we can here at Cherre in terms of the different number of partners through whom you can benchmark that we can connect to your asset management dashboards. Now, I can also see segmentation of the portfolio sliced any which way. What is the square footage by market exposure? where am I exposed to most in terms of any economic events that are occurring in these markets. In this case, Memphis has the highest concentration across the portfolio. I can drill in and immediately see the underlying properties in Memphis that comprise that part of the portfolio. What is my property size, portfolio property average size across the portfolio? Looks like I'm concentrated in below 50K square foot office buildings. Then who are the other people I'm working with? So who are my asset managers and what percentage of the portfolio do they manage? The brokerage companies that manage leasing on my behalf, as well as the property management companies that I'm exposed to. And I can turn on and off these metrics to see different shares of that management. Also see the number of leases by market across the portfolio, as well as the number of tenants. Then pivoting to some operational metrics, I can see the rent per square foot with properties within my portfolio, and I can benchmark that against the submarkets that those properties are located in, and instantaneously turn on and off different metrics for, let's say, the Galleria within Houston, comparing that against the properties within the Galleria submarket that are in my portfolio across the time series. The same for vacancy rates. I can also see portfolio leasing activity in terms of where my leasing activity or how my leasing activity has been trending, the number of leases executed, and who are my top tenants in terms of tenant exposure. Now, once again, this is a 30,000 foot executive level summary view, but I have additional capabilities here where I can drill in and actually see what are the properties in my portfolio. So if I pivot to the properties tab, one moment, I will see a list of properties, specifically the geographic concentration of those properties, the same KPIs that I saw on the summary page. And then I can just slice and dice this list in any which way I please to see which percentage of the portfolio this property occupies, what's its base rent, what's its occupancy. I can filter this down by a specific market, let's say Atlanta, and then immediately my KPIs will update. I can see the properties that I'm looking to see. Now, as an asset manager, I want to gauge the operational performance of the specific set of properties that I'm managing. So if I pivot over to the operational performance tab here, I've got a slightly different set of KPIs across my portfolio. In addition to occupancy, I have the number of tenants, the number of active leases, as well as the 12-month leasing activity. And I'm comparing all of these from the current month figures to the past 12 months, which is the prior period. I can see the trend of my performance. And then I get into some specific categories related to vacancy rates, rental rates, and leasing. And for each of these, I'm able to see the Lease benchmarks for the submarkets within my portfolio that I'm interested in. So let me go ahead and filter this down by asset manager to Barrett. Let's see, if I want to see just the properties that are under Barrett's purview, which are 34 properties in Atlanta. The KPIs will update instantaneously, and I can see what the critical operation performance metrics are here. So vacancy, the change in vacancy on a monthly basis, as well as a comparison to the submarkets in the portfolio. Do the same thing for rent, see where rents are trending within the submarket relative to my portfolio performance. For supply and demand specifically net absorption within the properties under Barrett's purview compared to the net absorption within the submarket. In this case, I'm interested in Center City. And so I can isolate Center City and just see the net absorption for that specific submarket because that's where Barrett's properties are located in for the most part, as well as net deliveries, and then lease expirations and tenants. So managing rollover risk or tenant risk is one of the primary functions of an asset manager in partnership with his leasing team of brokers, whether in-house or third party. I can see those lease expirations again, and I can see that in the first quarter of 2025, we've got major leases rolling. I can drill in and immediately see all of those underlying leases now at the asset manager level. See lease expirations by percentage of rentable square feet, lease expirations by annual base rent. Upcoming critical dates. Do I have renewals coming up? Do I have lease expirations coming up and where are they, as well as do I have payments coming up on certain accounts that I'm going to need to make. Here, I can have those critical updates come through and know exactly what I need to do and prioritize my activities on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. Top tenants by annual base rent and by square footage, as well as a summary table of my lease expirations going out 3 months, 6 months, 12 months into the future. Now, aside from operational performance, I'd also maybe want to just see all of the tenants or leases across my portfolio or a segment of that portfolio. So I can go over to the Tenants and Leases tab and see a list of all tenants across the portfolio, the rent paid, the total rent or the rent per square foot, total rent, number of leases, expiration date. These are rolled up by tenant. So if I have 8 Ogilvy public relations leases across the portfolio, we've consolidated them and are representing the annual total revenue effect from that tenancy, as well as seeing the granular leases themselves. So, what type of lease it is, the start date, the lease term, the end date, the square foot leased. And I can view that information very succinctly and slice and dice by any of these filters. Now, finally, from a financial performance perspective, I want to see how am I performing across the portfolio, as well as all the way down to the fund or property level. So pivoting to the financial performance tab, I can see my property count, as well as my revenue for the last month, my NOI for the last month across the entire portfolio, and a comparison with the 12 months prior, as well as my operating expenses. So going up and down the income and expense statement, I've got gross effective income, and I can select to view the trailing 12-month average for any of these metrics. And here we're displaying the actuals, but if you're entering in the budget data into your property management accounting system, whether it's Yardi or MRI, we can show that trend as well and show variance of actual against budget. Also, if you have data that was used to underwrite a specific property, if that data is in a structured file in Excel or maybe in Argus, we can overlay that here as well. So you can compare actual versus budget, see the variance, and also compare against underwriting, as well as third-party benchmarks on whichever time series charts are relevant. So here I can see my net operating income. Looks like I had a spike from December to January in NOI. I can see the ratio of my effective gross income to total expenses and toggle these on and off. Once again, since we're talking about returns and financial performance, I can see the NCREIF benchmarks that were shown on the portfolio summary tab for any property within the portfolio, as well as the top 10 properties by NOI, the distribution by market of NOI. Clearly here it's concentrated in the Atlanta area. And then get a granular view into the expenses at the portfolio level, and then also pivoting down to the property level. So what are my operating expenses over a time series, the operating expenses per square foot, and then very granular breakdowns between recoverable and non-recoverable, as well as controllable and non-controllable expenses. Now here, let me go ahead and pivot to a specific property. So I want to see these same financial performance figures for 7 West Jackson Boulevard in Houston, Texas. I can select that property, and immediately my KPIs will update to reflect information on revenue, NOI, and operating expenses for that property. For a 12-month time period, I can see how it performs against the NCREIF benchmark. I can see its operating expenses at a monthly basis, but I can pivot the periodicity to be by quarter or by year. See the property's recoverable and non-recoverable expenses. Once I eliminate, the real estate taxes, I can see that the biggest expenses are property management fees and property liability. And this is where I can also introduce yet another benchmark, and that being TREP. So TREP, which collects operating expense data across the CMBS portfolios across every market within the United States, is able to aggregate that information and provide me with averages by property type and subtype for total operating expenses across MSAs. In this case, my property is located in Houston, so I can see that for the Houston market, the operating expenses for 2020 were $10.33, and compare that against what they are in my portfolio, as well as see the time series of those operating expenses by MSA. So I can toggle off all of these other submarkets in the portfolio that are irrelevant to me and just isolate the time series for Houston. And I can see that it's $10.33, a little bit above where I'm at with this specific property. Then I can also see even more granular time series operating expense breakdown by month, and then dig into certain anomalies or spikes in expenses, also strategize on how to deploy, capital expenditure funds if I'm doing this at a portfolio level. So essentially, the highest degree of transparency and fidelity into your portfolio from a combination of your own internal data from your property management accounting system, as well as all of these benchmarks from third-party data providers that Cherre has connected on your behalf. Now, that is, the basic, although there's much more in these dashboards, that is probably the most salient part of their capability as it relates to performance monitoring, to reporting, whether you need to prepare information for a quarterly report or internally. And that is what I wanted to share with you today. So for this, I will turn it over to the host for Q&A.
Thanks, Yuri. And thank you, Cho. One of the questions I think that would be great to address would be, can you talk about data output? What if people need clean and standardized data back in Excel instead of a dashboard like you've been demonstrating?
Yeah, I can take that question. So this is also related to your question, Blake, that Cherre, we are a data connection and management platform. So we actually have the expertise to building out the standard data model that we talk about during the data strategy portion of the presentation. And we'll make sure that all the data that come into the pipeline are of the highest quality and fidelity. And one of the examples that we showed here is to have the data in a dashboard. However, with Cherre, we sell the platform that we offer the data through GraphQL API as well, that can be easily connected to your own dashboard environment or even in Excel through the Power Query function that comes with Microsoft Excel. So it's very easy to leverage Cherre data with everything connected and have resolution on top of that. We have done entity mapping. So the data are ready to use at your fingertips, and you can easily import those data back into your Excel spreadsheet and modeling.
Thank you, Cho. What about data, third-party data companies? Does Cherre help companies determine which data vendors would best fit their needs in terms of external data, et cetera? Third-party data, I guess, rather would be a better way to frame it.
Absolutely, I can take that one. So Cherre has a long-standing relationship with hundreds of data partners for any which use case. If it's asset management and it's the data partners that I spoke about today, whether it's Lease or RCA, whether it's macroeconomic trends through Oxford Economics or trends on migration through ADP or Unicast, employment factors, Cherre will help you customize whatever list of partners or connections you need to maximize your use case, whether that be market selection or acquisitions or asset management. We have seen it all, based on our experiences, and can give you, the right kind of recommendations and leverage our relationships with these data partners to produce the most outstanding result for your needs.
Thanks, Yuri. I think that would be all of the questions. Last question, if anyone wants to drop a question in the chat or the Q&A, I'll give you guys one more minute. Otherwise, I think that would be it. Going once, going twice. Okay, well, thank you all for joining. We will send out the recording and the PowerPoint slides that we shared. And we will see you guys all on the next webinar. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.